In 535 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire was coming off a resounding victory against the Vandal Kingdom in North Africa. Emboldened by success, Emperor Justinian was ready to turn his sights to the reconquest of Italy. After all, what is a Roman Empire without Rome? Italy was currently under the control of the Ostrogothic kingdom. After the barbarian general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor in 476, he reportedly sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, thereby declaring the office of Western emperor defunct. Eastern Emperor Zeno became wary of Odoacer as he established control over Italy and Dalmatia. In the Balkans, a Gothic chieftain named Theodoric had been causing problems for the east. Zeno sought to end two issues with one swift strike. He promised Theodoric that if he took his army to Italy and got rid of Odoacer, he would be allowed to rule the peninsula in his own right and as the emperor's representative. Theodoric agreed, marched his army to Italy, and won. Ostrogothic rule was established. Unlike the Vandals, the Goths tried to integrate themselves with the native Romans. They were tolerant of the Romans' different brand of Christianity, actively worked with the Roman Senate in matters of governance, and guaranteed the continuity of other Roman institutions. Still, the Goths established themselves as a ruling class, taking on roles of defense and land ownership, while the Romans settled into roles as administrators, farmers, laborers, and more. It was this Gothic political order Justinian hoped to topple. First, like with the Vandals, he needed a casus belli. After a prosperous rule, Theodoric died in 526. His successor was his grandson named Athalaric, who was 10. The boy's mother, Amalasuntha, was the regent and effective ruler of the Ostrogothic kingdom. Amalasuntha led a pro-Roman agenda and sought to have Athalaric educated in the Roman tradition. The Gothic aristocracy disdained being ruled by a woman and feared her influence would turn the young king weak and effeminate. So, they did what any group of good men would do and took the boy out to do manly things, like binge drinking. Athalaric loved hanging out with these boys, so much so that into his early teens, severe alcoholism was draining the boy's health. At the young age of 17, Athalaric was dead. He had drunk himself to death. Amalasuntha's position was crumbling without her son. Sensing her weakness, Justinian began putting pressure on her to cede territory to the emperor in exchange for safety. Amalasuntha delayed as long as she could, but the pressure was too much. Reluctantly, she turned to her cousin, a man named Theodahad. Because he was family, he had a claim to the throne. Amalasuntha needed to marry him and have him proclaimed king as soon as possible. Their relationship was tense and they had fiery disagreements, but hey, why let a little hatred and personal enmity get in the way of a good marriage? So, the two of them married, and Theodahad was proclaimed king. But as soon as the formalities were out of the way, he ordered Amalasuntha arrested. Turns out, hatred and personal enmity are more than enough to get in the way of a good marriage. Drat! Who knew? In Constantinople, Justinian was unable to abide the arrest of the pro-Roman Amalasuntha and flew into action. However, while he was in the process of demanding her release, Theodahad ordered her execution. Unwittingly, he had delivered Justinian's casus belli on a silver platter. Justinian's Italian operation had three distinct phases. First, he would apply purely diplomatic pressure in the hopes of securing concessions. If that failed, he would authorize limited military operations along three fronts. First, an incursion into Sicily. Second, an incursion into Dalmatia. And third, bribes would be sent to the Franks to incite an incursion into the north. After a little more saber-rattling, Theodahad would hopefully concede more territory, maybe even all of Italy. Finally, if the Goths resisted, Justinian would authorize full-scale military operations into the Italian peninsula. Phase 1 had already ended after Justinian's attempts to pressure Amalasuntha had failed. It was time for Phase 2. Belisarius was appointed to head the Sicilian Expedition force, the most important one. He loaded about 8,000 soldiers aboard his ships and set sail. His orders were to stop at Sicily as though they were heading to Carthage and assess the situation. If the island's defenses were too strong, he was to continue sailing. If practicable, he was to take the island. The war began with the Roman incursion into Dalmatia. There, they successfully captured their objective, the city of Salona. Around the same time, Belisarius landed in Sicily. To his pleasant surprise, not only were the Gothic forces scant, but the native population was ready to support his efforts. His forces set out right away, and town after town surrendered as he approached. Only Panormus put up any resistance. Here, Belisarius showed off his famed ingenuity. The city's walls were strong on land, but their sea walls weren't even as tall as the masts on the Roman ships. After fixing platforms to the masts, Belisarius had the ships sail to the harbor with his archers firing down on the defenders. The panicked garrison surrendered shortly after, and Belisarius' conquest of Sicily was swiftly complete. In the north, the Franks had been receptive to Justinian's bribes and were massing their forces on the northern border. Under pressure on 3 different fronts, the Otahad was ready to capitulate and open negotiations. What a dream come true for Justinian. Before they could formally surrender, the Roman efforts were hit with a double whammy. First, the Goths counterattacked in Dalmatia. They were defeated but killed the Roman general Mundus in the process. The imperial army retreated shortly after to regroup. At nearly the exact same time, a mutiny broke out in North Africa and Carthage was put under siege. Belisarius was forced to leave Sicily and deal with the problem. The rebels broke the siege almost as soon as he arrived and headed inland. Belisarius followed them with only around 2,000 troops. Outnumbered 4-1, he met them in a single-pitched battle. The mutineers were effectively leaderless, and while haphazardly repositioning to keep the wind out of their faces, Belisarius recognized an opportunity and charged. The rebels scattered. As quickly as possible, Belisarius returned to Sicily. He had bought enough time for somebody else to finish off the rebels. His mission was in Sicily, and his presence there was crucial. The death of Mundus and the African mutiny took pressure off the Goths at a pivotal time. The Otahad now felt confident he could win this war. I can't stress just how close Justinian was here, but the second phase had failed. He appointed a new general to take Dalmatia and authorized Belisarius to conduct full military operations in Italy. Belisarius took most of his army and sailed to southern Italy. Once there, the defenseless southern cities fell with ease. Within just a few months, he had captured Bruttium, Lucania, and Campania with no contest. However, his lightning-quick advance would be abruptly stopped as he came across Naples, a city with daunting walls and a strong Gothic garrison. When faced with a siege, the attacker has 4 options. 1. Assault the city walls. 2. Encircle the city and starve them out. 3. Bypass the city. 4. Negotiated surrender, which can include bribery and threats. Looking at the small size of his army, Belisarius knew there was no attacking the walls. He absolutely could not afford the losses. Starving out the garrison would take time, and the threat of Gothic reinforcements was always around the corner. Bypassing the city would leave their flanks and supply lines vulnerable. He was left with option 4. Belisarius tried to open a dialogue with the Goths, but it was pretty clear to them he was just blowing smoke, and they weren't buying it. Dang. All these options suck. You might be asking, what's left other than to just go home? Well, that's where the oft unexplored 5th option comes in: trickery. Belisarius ordered his troops to evaluate the city walls for weaknesses. After a couple weeks, one of his surveyors returned with a report. There was an out-of-commission and unguarded aqueduct that the Romans just might be able to widen enough to fit men through. Under the cover of night, Belisarius ordered his engineers in. They widened the aqueduct, and the next thing you know, the gates of the city were being thrown wide open after hundreds of imperial troops filtered in. As Naples was captured, Belisarius prohibited his men from doing any harm to the Gothic garrison. They were to be prisoners. His clemency here set the precedent that surrender was a viable option for the Goths. If they gave up, their safety was guaranteed. Although, let's not pretend he was doing this out of goodwill. During negotiations, Belisarius issued vague threats to the Neapolitan citizens that, were they to resist, he wouldn't be able to stop his barbarian auxiliary troops from sacking the city. The Neapolitans were about to give up, but at the last second, 2 Gothic lieutenants convinced them to continue the fight. Once the city was taken, Belisarius lived up to his threats, and as the Hunnic and Herule cavalrymen trampled across the city, thousands of Neapolitan citizens were slaughtered. But before they were, to enact their vengeance, the terrified Neapolitans caught and lynched the 2 Gothic lieutenants who had convinced them to fight. Yikes. In Rome, Theodahad was on the hot seat. He had done nothing to stop the lightning-quick advance of Belisarius, and the people were angry. After the loss of Naples, enough was enough. The Gothic aristocrats elected a new king, and Theodahad was butchered in the streets as he tried to flee. Theodahad having done nothing, the new Gothic king named Vitiges set out to fight some fires. Belisarius had caused massive problems in the south. The Roman army in the east had recently retaken Dalmatia, and the Franks in the north were still threatening invasion. The first of these threats Vitiges chose to deal with was the Franks. He left a garrison of 4,000 men in Rome and left with the rest of his army northwards after taking most of the Roman Senate hostage. As we will soon learn, choosing not to fight Belisarius during this time was a huge mistake. Shortly after the fall of Naples, the rest of Campania and Apulia surrendered. Belisarius was now ready to march on Rome. After receiving an invitation from the Pope and people of Rome to enter the city, Belisarius marched, leaving a small garrison behind in Naples. The Gothic garrison had absolutely no idea how the people of Rome felt until, to their great surprise, they found the gates of the city being thrown wide open as Belisarius' army arrived outside the walls. As the Romans marched into the city, the Gothic garrison slipped out through the back. Their commander stayed behind in shame to surrender to Belisarius personally. Rome was back in the empire after a bloodless capture. At this point, Belisarius decided he could no longer safely conduct offensive operations. After leaving garrisons, he was left with about 5,000 men. Continuing northward would leave him dangerously overextended. Rather, this was the perfect time for him to switch to a defensive posture. If the Goths wanted in, they would have to grind themselves down in a siege. To prepare, Belisarius shored up the city's defenses by digging a moat around the 12-mile-long circuit of walls and repairing any damaged areas of the 52-foot-high defenses. He stockpiled his provisions and sent small garrisons to occupy the undefended walled cities of Narnia, Spoletum, and Perugia. Doing so gave him control over the most direct route to Rome, and would force Vitiges to either grind his army down taking the walled cities, or use a longer, more circuitous route for his supply trains. Vitiges was going to fight on Belisarius' terms. After striking a deal with the Franks, Vitiges headed south. As he arrived in the area, he chose to bypass the forts and headed straight to Rome. Before we get into it, we need to address something. Our main source here is the personal chronicler of Belisarius, a guy named Procopius. While much of his accounts seem well within reason, there are portions that are clearly embellishment. For example, Procopius claims Vitiges arrived with a force of 150,000 men. This is almost certainly not true. If it were, Vitiges would have had no problem fully encircling the city of Rome. In reality, he didn't even try. More convincing estimates are within the ballpark of 25 to 35,000. Still a strong advantage. The siege of Rome is also full of stories of the personal bravery and heroism of Belisarius. We're gonna get into these because they're good fun, but please do take them with a little grain of salt. Upon arrival, Vitiges came across a Roman sentry post set up at the Milvian Bridge. When they saw what was coming, the Roman sentries immediately deserted. Belisarius and 1,000 of his elite cavalry were riding out to do a routine checkup on the sentries. To their great shock, the area was swarming with Goths. They fought tooth and nail to get to the outpost, with Belisarius fighting personally in the front lines. Once they learned of the sentries' desertion, they disengaged and rode back to the walls of Rome. There, the wall guards refused to open the gates, thinking it was a Gothic trick. It wasn't until Belisarius and his troops charged into a nearby group of Goths that the soldiers were convinced. Back inside, instead of punishment, Belisarius commended the guards for their caution. The Goths set up fortified encampments at 7 locations. 6 were on the east side of the Tiber, between the Flaminian and Praenestine gates. The 7th was on the Vatican Plains on the west side, meant to secure the strategically important Milvian Bridge. The Goths' first move was to cut the aqueducts bringing water into the city. These lines were not used for drinking water, but to operate the city's grain mills. Without them, Rome would starve. Belisarius acted quickly by fixing wheels between 2 boats and using the force of the Tiber to grind the grain. The Goths sent logs and other debris down the river to destroy the mills, but Belisarius hung a chain across the Tiber which caught the debris. Dozens more boat mills were set up following this ingenious approach. On the 18th day, Vitiges launched his big assault. When Belisarius looked over the walls to see what they were doing, he loudly laughed. His soldiers were confused by this laughter, verging on angry, but when Belisarius pointed out their battering rams and siege towers were being pulled by exposed oxen, it all made sense. After personally felling 3 Goths with as many shots of the bow, Belisarius ordered his archers to target the oxen and men pulling the engines into place, rendering them useless. After, he ordered a sally to destroy the siege engines along with any lingering Goths. Elsewhere, the Goths made more progress, but were always defeated. Over at the Vivarium Gate, the Goths had been digging a mine to destroy a section of the walls underneath. Not knowing what to do, the men called for Belisarius. When he arrived, he calmly devised a plan to build fortifications around the area the Goths were destroying. Later in the day, the section of walls crumbled. When the Goths emerged from the breach, all they found was another wall and a flurry of arrows. They fell back, chased out by the Romans at every step of the way. Frustrated by the failure of his big assault, Vitiges ordered the murders of the senators he had earlier taken hostage. This was getting ugly. Vitiges' aim was now to constrain the Byzantine supply as much as possible. He sent a force to capture Portus, the main harbor that was supplying Rome. The Romans now had to use the ports of Ostia and Antium and transport the supplies overland, limiting the provisions they could bring in. At the same time, Belisarius began to lead a very active defense. He relocated the women and children of Rome to Naples in order to alleviate his supply issues, and conscripted all able-bodied Roman men to fight in the garrison. After, with his professional horse archers, he engaged the enemy in hit-and-run tactics. He sent his cavalry to occupy nearby high ground, hail the enemy with arrows, and only retreat when they either ran out of arrows or when their way back was threatened. The Gothic cavalry was only trained to use spears and swords. Every time they charged, the Roman cavalry would simply reposition, then keep firing. These tactics proved extremely effective, and the Goths had absolutely no answer. The success of these skirmishes brought confidence. Belisarius was suddenly under pressure from his troops to go out and battle the Goths. Eventually, he gave in and started drawing up plans. Initially, he planned to engage with cavalry only, using his weaker, unprofessional infantry as rally points near the walls. His infantry commanders argued fiercely, trying to get in on the action. Eventually, Belisarius was convinced after 2 of his lieutenants promised the infantry would not break. They would fight. He sent a portion of his cavalry and infantry to pin down the Goths on the west side of the Tiber, whilst the rest of the army would attack the camps on the east. The troops marched out and met in battle. At first, things were going really well, but when the cavalry on the right tried to regroup behind the infantry, panic spread and most of the infantry immediately began to rout. Seizing the opportunity, the Goths on the right wheeled and routed the rest of the Roman army. The day would have been a complete disaster, but a contingent of the infantry, led by the 2 lieutenants, put up a last stand and allowed the army to escape. They both paid with their lives. Belisarius reverted to his hit-and-run tactics for the rest of the year to great effect. As winter came and went, scouts reported to Belisarius that the Goths were barely conducting patrols or even leaving their camps at night. It appeared their morale was very low. The Roman navy was preventing the Goths from importing food by sea, and the Roman control of the Via Flaminia was putting lots of pressure on their supply lines. Belisarius sent out detachments to occupy small forts and attack Gothic foraging parties, putting even more pressure on their supply situation. Pretty soon, famine and disease broke out in the Gothic camps. The besiegers had become the besieged. Later, Belisarius received words that reinforcements had arrived in Italy. To keep them from being attacked on their way in, he launched a daring attack on one of the Gothic camps. A force was sent from the Pincian Gate to distract the Gothic camp near the Via Flaminia. As they began to pursue the Romans, another force was sent from the Flaminian Gate, which the Goths had previously thought to have been blocked off. The two Roman units crashed into the Goths, encircling and destroying them. While they were licking their wounds, the Roman reinforcements were able to enter the city. Seeking some respite, Vitiges sought and received a 3-month truce to discuss peace terms in Constantinople. Belisarius used this time to improve his position. The Goths had been forced to abandon Portus and some surrounding areas due to attrition. Belisarius sent troops to occupy the areas. Next, a commander named John was sent with a force of 2,000 cavalry behind enemy lines. His mission was to encamp near Picenum and be ready to take the region when the truce ended. The Goths were caught completely off guard by the Romans' ability to conduct offensive operations after the grueling year-long siege. Under pressure, Vitiges decided to break the truce. He sent men to inspect the aqueducts of Rome, like Belisarius had done in Naples. Feeling like he could repeat the brilliant move, he sent engineers to open one of them up, but they were caught in the act. With this, Belisarius authorized John to take Picenum, which he swiftly did. John then exceeded his orders, and went on, and went on, and went on, all the way to the city of Ariminum, who threw open their gates for him. Ariminum was just a day's march from the Gothic capital of Ravenna. Now feeling severely threatened, Vitiges felt he had no option but to break the siege of Rome. Belisarius had won. As the Goths were retreating across the Milvian Bridge, he ordered one last sortie across the Vatican plains, cutting down any Goth who had failed to cross. It was a resounding victory. As Army Major Anthony Brogna states, quote, "The defense of Rome was a part of an integrated campaign plan to reduce the Goths' numbers and fighting spirit." End quote. Before, conducting further offensive operations would have been extremely dangerous, but after, Belisarius was more or less free to continue his conquest of Italy. His switch from a strategic offensive posture to a tactical defensive one came at the perfect time. While the battle outside the walls of Rome was certainly a miscalculation, the rest of the siege had been handled brilliantly. Throughout the entire siege, Belisarius kept constant pressure on the Goths, both actively with skirmishing and passively by creating supply constraints. Just as with his African campaign, he was able to identify the units that held the greatest advantages over the Goths and deploy them not only to incredible success, but in a way the Goths couldn't even hope to contend with. His active scouting and communications expertise led him to being constantly informed of the enemy's situation and where they were moving. His deployment of John, among many other examples, again portrays a keen eye for opportunities and both the initiative and courage to act on them.